Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're coming to order now. This is the Public Works Committee, and as usual with our committees, we have a general agenda and a consent agenda. We have only 2 items on the general agenda, and one of those will probably be fairly brief since it was discussed pretty exhaustively at Public Safety. Are there any items that need to be pulled from the consent agenda?
Mr. Chairman, if there are none, I move for approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
All right, so it's been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda. Those in favor, please vote yes. Those opposed, vote no. And that's unanimously approved. Thank you. We'll go back then to G1, if you'll call that, please.
G1, ordinance to regulate the use of electric scooters and manage shared mobility system operators in the city of Winston-Salem.
All right, was there anyone who was not here at the meeting last evening that had this discussion? I think it was very well covered at Public Safety. I had a chance to give my comments. Perhaps a brief overview for anyone listening in.
I will try. It's not my strong suit.
Well, I tell you what, since there are only 2 items left, you can be brief within the context of brevity for you, Council.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm Marilena Jensen-Goodhold. I'm an assistant city attorney. We did discuss this last night, so I was just going to focus more on the comments that were raised or the issues that were raised in last month's Public Works Committee and touch on a few points I wanted to clarify from last night. So we did have a question about how we enforce the ordinance, so I'm going to run through that just very quickly. We can revoke, suspend, or deny a permit. We can impound a device and charge impound fees. We can charge civil penalties. We can sue for abatement or mandatory or prohibitory injunction. Violators have to reimburse us our investigative costs. In addition, we require permittees to sign an agreement, and that is good because in addition to having provisions in the ordinance and the permit which requires companies to indemnify us if they cause us to incur liability, we'll have contractual provisions that require the same. That gives us a contractual remedy too. Sometimes when you're trying to enforce indemnification provisions in a permit, it can be a little bit tricky because you don't have the privity of contract, you don't have the signature on the document, so it's good to have it in an agreement as well. We also require companies to issue a bond to cover their obligations. That gives us a readily available source of money, and if a company goes out of business, we have recourse. We have somewhere we can look to if we have to spend a lot of money to gather up all the scooters that are left behind. Bonds are a little bit different from insurance. They're more performance-based as opposed to insurance, which is claims-based. So if scooters are littering a sidewalk but haven't caused injury, we wouldn't make a claim on the insurance policy. But if we spend $1,000 to collect the scooters, we can draw on the bond. So that's why it's good to have insurance and a bond. We decided not to do criminal penalties, and in part that's because I've been told that pursuing criminal violations against a business entity is challenging for prosecutors. You have to serve someone high up in the organization. You have to prove that they knew what was going on down to the lower echelon of the organization, and that's just more difficult to prove, and you have to consider how much of the taxpayer dollar you want to spend trying to prove it. So that's enforcement. We had a question about underage kids hacking scooters and using them. We had that question again last night, and so we do have a permit requirement that requires companies to provide a mechanism such as scanning the rider's ID so they can check the age of the rider before the ride is initiated. Don't know quite what we can do about the situation where an overage rider rents a scooter on behalf of an underage rider. We can require compliance with the company's own terms of use regarding ridership and with our ordinances. I believe their terms of use actually say that the guardian is liable for the younger person's use of the scooter. We were asked to define the fee structure and make it really clear and explicit, also to make it more robust. So we included a schedule of fees and penalties at the end of the ordinance, which only applies to permittees or people renting out scooters without a permit. And that structure is the initial permit fee is $1,000. The device fee is $100 per scooter, $50 per dockless electric assisted bicycle, $25 per dockless human-powered bicycle. There's a permit renewal fee of $500. There's an impound fee of $50 a day for each device, and there's a civil penalty of $250 for a violation. One point about the fees and their robustness is that we hold the public right-of-way in trust for the public. So arguably, we have an obligation to charge fair market value for the use of the public right-of-way, whatever that is. However, if we do that and the fair market value is greater than our cost to administer the micromobility device program, Then there's an argument that we're making money from the enterprise, and if we ever get sued, the court might say that this was a proprietary function because we made money from it instead of a governmental function, and we would jeopardize our defense of governmental immunity. So my recommendation is that with respect to the fees, we want to make them robust, but not too robust. We don't want to make them so steep that we lose our defense of governmental immunity, even though making them steeper gives us more leverage in terms of compliance and compliance with ADA requirements, that kind of thing. There was a suggestion that we adjust the impound fee depending on the egregiousness of the offense. We're going to do that. There was also a suggestion that we consider deducting impounded devices from the authorized fleet until companies pay fines to retrieve the devices, because a company might ditch a used scooter we've impounded if it's cheaper to buy a new one than to pay our fine. So we're going to implement that. There was a comment about visibility on streets at night. So public safety, or the police department, recommended that each scooter be equipped with both front and rear lights that emit white visible light, visible from a distance of 500 feet in either direction. We are going to change the rear one probably to a red reflector, and we're going to make sure that the lights are visible from the sides as well. That was the comment that came out last night. We were asked to address private scooters in some manner. So the bulk of this ordinance, as you know, addresses commercial shared use devices. There are a few provisions which regulate private devices. Since shared use devices are commercial for-profit enterprises and private use are not, we think it's appropriate to regulate the private devices with respect to public safety. So helmets, location, that kind of thing. In order to enforce those regulations, of course, we need an enforcement mechanism, and that is impoundment of devices. A civil penalty would have been an option because it's like a parking ticket. You pay it, it goes away. It doesn't go on anybody's criminal record or their driving record, but we opted for impoundment instead. There was an objection, and I'm going to spend a little more time on this, if I may, to making companies include their mechanics and their juicers, who are the people who charge their devices, to making them additional insureds on their insurance policies. Now, we removed that requirement in response to the objection. We're not sure that we want to regulate the relationship between the companies and their subs. However, allow me to make this point. Lime and Bird are not small businesses. As I understand it, they're each currently valued at about $2 billion. So they're huge companies, and so the investment to include their subs as additional insureds to protect the city and its constituents may be a drop in the bucket for them, we don't know. Also, despite being as large as they are, if they fold at any point, we might be left holding the bag. This is unlike the situation where you have an employer and employees, because employers have something called, it's a legal doctrine called respondeat superior. So they're vicariously liable for the acts of their employees performed within the scope of employment. In addition, employers' insurance often covers the employees acting within the scope of employment, that kind of thing. So it's kind of comparing apples to oranges a little bit. What we're talking about here is a subcontractor relationship with the mechanics and the juicers. We don't have the same protections. And it is possible that mechanics and juicers can expose the city to some liability. For example, a colleague told me about a failure by a mechanic to properly maintain a scooter's brakes, and that resulted in the death of a gentleman in DuPont Circle, Washington, D.C. His family threatened to sue the city. We don't know if that's happened yet. There have also been media reports about equipment malfunctions, such as brakes that fail, throttles that stick, handlebars that become detached from baseboards, and scooters that break in half mid-ride, and allegedly accidents have resulted. Now, I don't know if those media reports are accurate and how much of the purported equipment malfunction is due to maintenance failure or some other defect, but it is possible to envision a scenario where a failure to maintain can cause an injury, and someone gets injured, and when someone gets injured, they sue everyone. They're going to sue the city too. Plus, there is a photo that IMLA has used of juicers and mechanics, one person who rode 10 scooters stacked one on top of the other simultaneously, and you can imagine that could be hazardous to other users of the public right-of-way. In addition, if they use vehicles to redistribute devices, there could be some liability there. Another area where we could receive some exposure is if juicers and mechanics leave scooters obstructing the public right-of-way, improperly parked in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The feds may come and say that we're liable for allowing the dockless devices in the right-of-way. That's an unsettled point of law. And there doesn't appear to be a court opinion regarding governmental immunity with respect to permitting of micromobility devices. Of course, we would argue that transportation is a governmental function, but if a court finds that it's proprietary, as I mentioned previously, then we're exposed. So this is why insurance and indemnification are so important, even with respect to the activities of juicers and mechanics. We do ask the companies to indemnify us, and they could ask their subcontractors in turn to produce their own insurance policies. But your indemnification is only as good, as I mentioned last night, as the insurance that's in place to back it up. If the companies are going to indemnify us, there should be some kind of an insurance policy to back it up. Not clear if they can actually include their subs as additional insureds, but they could ask their subs to secure insurance policies of their own. If the subs are not somehow insured, we're not going to be able to make a claim on an insurance policy. It won't get paid. So we'd be left going after a company that may or may not fold, or a sub who may not have any money. So also, if the companies use the public infrastructure that the tax money pays for, and city resources to manage their product, they turn a profit, they keep the revenue, but pass along the liabilities for the actions of their subs, taxpayers may not have a meaningful or easy recourse. If, on the other hand, there's an insurance policy to go after, constituents will be better protected because they will have a streamlined process. They'll only be dealing with one party as opposed to multiple parties pointing fingers at each other trying to pass the buck, that kind of thing. So incidentally, the requirement to include subs, chargers, and mechanics as additional insurers, or to pass the insurance requirement to them, is a recommendation of the International Municipal Lawyers Association. And it's not clear, as I said before, that is in fact feasible. It's a very new area, but they could ask their subs to obtain their own insurance policies. If it's not enough just for us as the city to be named additional insured, yes, council member, it's not enough for the city to be named additional insured, because if something results a liability from the actions of a sub, the insurance company is going to say, well, they're independent contractors, they're not covered. So we're not going to cover this claim because it was the result of an action of a sub, even if we ourselves are named additional insured. Also, we don't have privity of contract with the subs. We are not the ones with the contracts with the subs. The companies are the ones with the contracts with their subs, so we can't sue on the contract. So what does this mean? I think what we need to do is have dialogue with the companies and ask them, how do you deal with claims relating to the work of your subs? What would you propose? Is there some kind of a middle ground where we can be protected and do something that's feasible for you as well? Now, we had a comment about the length of the ordinance, the concern there. If you have every requirement of the ordinance is going to be long. Our ordinance is by no means long. For comparison, Charlotte's ordinance is 15 pages, University Park, Texas is 12, LA's is 30, Portland, Oregon's is 17, Santa Monica's is 23, Seattle's is 61, but that includes permit and ordinance, and I think they actually don't permit scooters there. I think it's dockless bikes. But the long and the short of it is that short ordinances often correspond to longer permit documents. Shorter ordinances, they put the bulk of their requirements in their permit documents, so it's really 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Since this is new technology, it's okay, I think, to be overly inclusive and remove provisions as needed. Once you let the cat out of the bag, it's a little bit hard to put it back in. There was a concern about the number of restrictions in the ordinance. These restrictions are standard fare in jurisdictions where these companies operate. We did not reinvent the wheel, but I will bring you more information on that next time. There was a request that we have access, I believe, to whatever data the companies collect. And certainly we will collect the data that we need. We'll make that a requirement. We should only request anonymized data, not data containing uniquely or personally identifiable information, and only such data as we require to fulfill our mission, such as trip, parking, collision, maintenance data, that kind of thing. That way, we minimize our liability and exposure under data breach laws, and we don't have to contend with public records requests for information we didn't really need in the first place. We will require companies to maintain the confidentiality of information they collect and abide with applicable laws concerning data safety, data breach, consumer protection. There was a suggestion that docked and dockless bicycles be treated the same from a safety perspective. We can do that, except when it comes to the regulation of placement of the devices in the right-of-way, because dockless devices do expose us to liability under the ADA in a way that docked devices do not. Also, when you have a docking station encroaching in your right-of-way, you should theoretically be able to charge more money for that. And then finally, we had a question about whether we require insurance certificates for docked bikes. And we do. Docked bikes currently go through the encroachment process, as Matthew mentioned at the Public Works Committee meeting last month. We require an insurance certificate naming us additional insured during the pendency of the encroachment and for 1 year thereafter to secure the company's indemnification obligations with respect to their facilities, the permitted activities in the right-of-way, damage to the city's or a third party's person or property, the breach of a provision of the encroachment agreement, and a couple of other circumstances. However, dockless bicycles present hazard and liability issues that docked bicycles do not. They can be strewn about the public right-of-way, presents the possibility for injury more that way, and also the concern under the ADA. So that's it in a nutshell. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
That was a long,
All right, good job.
And
Do we have
that was a long nutshell.
new questions for this evening's meeting? Yes?
I want to pursue this indemnification question a little bit, probe that. What you're saying is that the subcontractors, well, that the primary contractor, Birdlime, whoever, stands between his subs and the city, protecting us from any misconduct, liabilities, or whatever. That would be the normal case. What you're afraid of is if that primary contractor, provider, disappears, then there's nothing between the city and the subs to protect us. Is that?
That is true. Yes, that is exactly one scenario. And then also, if somebody were to say, well, they're an independent contractor, therefore we're not liable for their actions, that's between you and them. They did it, not us.
So in order to protect the city under an arrangement where the subcontractors and the Lime or Bird have an agreement of performance, is there not a method that that they will have a list of their subcontractors? I'll know who they are. Cannot those individual subcontractors sort of assign a release of liability to the city individually?
Well, if they signed a release and it was legally enforceable, they would be releasing us from claims that they themselves
That they prepare.
incur. So if they get injured. But in terms of a third party, that's not indemnification if a third party sues us because of what they do. They would, and we could ask them to indemnify us, but the reality is they probably don't have very deep pockets.
Right. They're not going to buy. They don't want to buy insurance just for this. They're not going to buy $1 million policy.
So, council member, what I would propose is that we put it back on the companies to tell us what can we do, how can we work together, how can you give us comfort, is there an option we haven't thought of, what is possible. So I think we want to work with the companies, and that's part of the purpose of delaying this until next month so that we can actually have communication with the industry, because I have not had a chance to share this ordinance with them, and I would like to get their input.
Did I understand correctly that the policies of indemnification survive the termination of the contract with the company for 6 months or something?
Yes, I believe that's so.
In other words, if a company goes out of business, theoretically, that policy would remain in place for 6 months afterwards?
Yes, if that's what I put in the ordinance.
And all of their equipment, everything would be removed. So exposure of stuff that they had would not be available during that 6-month period. We'd still be covered, though, right?
Yes. So if I apologize, I don't remember if I put that in the ordinance, but if I did, which is something I typically would do, yes, the protection would endure after the termination. Right. So if somebody comes up with an injury they say they sustained 3 months ago and it's only manifested itself, I don't know what a possible scenario could be. But theoretically, that would be the purpose of having the.
Well, maybe we need to look at sustaining the period of durability of their policy a little longer, even though if they go out of business, their stuff is gone. I mean, all their equipment, everything that they do is gone from our streets. But our concern is what you're saying is an injury that may have occurred earlier. So, I mean, I think what we're looking at here is holding the primary company responsible. Yes. For the duration of exposure that we may have, if that's the case, if they go out of business.
Yes, or their insurance company somehow. And I don't know everything that is possible and all the possible scenarios because this technology is new, especially new to Winston. So I think we have to be a little more cautious and more protective until we see how things unfold on the ground, and then we can always come back and adjust our ordinance requirements if we see there's no need for a certain requirement.
Well, in this dispersed economy, that we're developing, it's hard to hold accountability. But my accountability comes to that primary supplier, whether it be Bird, Lime, whoever is, how they get their job done. And it is not really my concern as long as the city is protected. And if they're subcontractors, they're leases, they're renters, they're suppliers, whatever they got, it's their responsibility to protect the city. And whatever that means for whatever duration their presence in Winston-Salem was, we need some way to make sure that their single point accountability remains.
I agree, council member. I think we need to be protected. We need to be protected. What that looks like, I don't know yet. I think that will evolve with the discussions with the industry, but somehow we need to be protected.
Okay, other new questions? No other new questions from the committee. I just would note, please be prepared when he comes back to report to us on what you were able to do in terms of insurance requirements to the company that would require them to indemnify us against the actions or failures of their subcontractors.
Yes, sir.
Basically, the companies are electing to go with the subcontractor business model. We just need to make sure that somebody who actually has assets is responsible for that. Okay, I see that there are 3 folks who have signed up who specifically want to comment on the micromobility system. Now, this is not designed as a public hearing, but with the and it is coming back. But with the committee's indulgence, may I invite the folks up for 2 minutes each?
2 minutes is fine.
Okay. All right. In that case, on this issue, and Mr. Summers has signed up to comment on both agenda items. But on this issue, Mr. Summers, would you care to come and give us your 2 minutes on the current state of the ordinance draft?
Thank you. I'm Philip Summers of 2422 Peachtree Street. I just wasn't sure how to sign up. I don't have to come up a second time. My comments are very broad, and they are just in favor of getting more participation in the streets. I'd like us to be more pedestrian-oriented. I was really just amazed when Bird was here, how many people you saw in the streets. I thought it created a lot of opportunity. I'm friends with people who found it to be a real blessing. It helped them get to jobs, low-paying jobs. So I think we have a great responsibility to create mobility options at a bunch of different levels. I feel like we're being overly cautious. She's using very many words to describe some level of comfort that I don't think exists. It's risky to live and walk around, and I don't think we can cover ourselves from every angle. So I would just say, if you could think about them like bicycles, that's my primary mode of transportation is a bicycle, and the main reason I rise to speak is I'd love to see more people on the road. I think I'd feel safer if there were just more people out there and being visible. So I think there's a certain amount of solidarity that I'm looking for out of the Bird riders. I think we would all be safer if there were just more mobility options. And I think ultimately we should get a little more liberty. I think we should be able to decide as adults. So I think just philosophically, I wanted to say citizens that are very interested in seeing the micromobility devices come back sooner rather than later, without further delay.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Summers. And stick around. We will have the pedestrian safety report as a principal item. Mr. Hugel, is it? With Lime scooters. Mr. Hugel, are you also in a position to talk for Lime bikes?
Yes. The company, Charles Hugel, 2003 Spring Garden Street, Greensboro, North Carolina. So the company Lime Bike, they changed their name a few months ago to Lime. So we are in Greensboro now, operating scooters and bikes. The purpose of me coming here was because we went through a very similar situation in Greensboro. As of last November, both Bird and Lime were temporarily banned as the city established and implemented a permitting process. As of January 28th, the Lime scooters are back in Greensboro. We've completed the permitting process, and we're working with the city, the Greensboro DOT, to make things run smoothly for both what they want and for our company. So it seems like you may have a lot of questions about liability and legalities. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to answer those. But if you have more general questions about our operation, about our vehicles, things like that, I'd love to answer them for you.
All right, thank you. Let me just ask our attorney, do we have a copy of the Greensboro ordinance in effect for comparison purposes?
We do. We looked at it, we used it and Greensboro's permit documents, and we borrowed some of their provisions. I also spoke to Greensboro's attorney who drafted the Greensboro ordinance, and she described Lime. She said they were pretty cooperative, and also that I think that a lot of your operations are on UNCG's campus. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
If Mr. Hugel, if we'll put your time back on the clock here. I want to ask a follow-up question of the attorney. How would you compare the Greensboro ordinance with the draft that we have in front of us?
Greensboro's ordinance is a lot briefer than ours, but they do have some pretty extensive permit documents, and we borrowed some of those provisions for our own documents as well.
Okay, well, I'll be interested to see that. Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Hugel, do you have other comments?
Yes, so the proposed regulations are very similar. One thing that the city of Greensboro did is the city council rejected the nighttime operating ban from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. The idea behind it was that it would be safer if scooters were not operating in the dark. However, the hours were somewhat arbitrary because depending on different times of year, the daylight ends at different times. So they passed the proposed ordinance, but removed that piece. And part of it was because it was somewhat arbitrary. Part of it was because other forms of transportation are not banned in the city during different times. So that's the only comment that I have about what's being proposed here.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and Mr. Easter. And again, you're invited to stick around and comment on the pedestrian safety too, but I know that you have comments on the microphone bill.
Yes, I do. Thank you for having me. Jake Easter, 3407 Luther Street. And you might recognize me from some cycling advocacy, and there's a lot of crossover here. And just to be clear, like I'm way in favor of having the scooters here, having extra transportation options, and like Philip was saying, like, and actually it's a statistic, it's proven that, you know, more people per capita, and this is for cycling specifically, but more people per capita that cycle, the safer cycling becomes. So the more people that we have out and about and moving in a similar fashion as cyclists, the more safer our roads are going to be for everybody. But just a couple challenges, like these things are really, really convenient, and that I think is what appeals to people. What is not really, really convenient is having a helmet handy. So the helmet thing kind of like puts me off a little. I know I will use them less if I have to wear a helmet. And then also like enforcing the helmet laws, like are we going to, you know, potentially have responsible users not ride them and have people who are irresponsible riding them without helmets. And then also like the time restriction, it's the same case for me. Like if we really wanted to make these things safer, what we would do is actually limiting the roads that they can be on. So also from the cycling advocacy world, the lower the speed road, the more safe it is to ride on it. So like riding on Peters Creek is going to be way more dangerous than riding on 4th Street downtown. So like the lighting thing is one thing, but If you really want to make them safe, you would take them off of higher speed streets. And one more thing, if I can get just 30 more seconds. The subcontractor issue with insurance, I actually have personal experience with this. I signed up to charge birds, and I know for a fact that they don't make enough money to provide their own insurance. And to be honest, they don't make enough money to provide the transportation and the smartphone and everything else necessary. So maybe there's like a two birds with one stone, and try to figure out a way to hire contractors that get paid enough to provide the service that they're providing to Bird or Lime or whoever. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Easter. And in fact, I think that the modest compensation for subcontractors is baked into the business model here. That may change as a result of regulation. Okay, well, thank you very much. Very useful comments. Other questions this evening about this matter? We'll be coming back. Mr. Taylor, is it coming back to public safety next month or
In March.
in March? Okay, so we'll anticipate that. All right, thank you. We'll then go on to item G2, please.
G2, pedestrian crash data and analysis.
Okay, and now this is the one that I requested and have been jumping up and down about for quite a while. So, yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, committee members.
Good evening.
So, hopefully you have the materials in front of you. There were 3 items attached to this. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Yeah.
Bursick, if you'll, for folks listening who don't
Sure. Sir Matthew Burchek. I'm the bicycle and pedestrian coordinator with the city DOT.
know. Thank you. Go ahead.
So there were three separate items attached to this agenda item: the map, the time of day analysis, and the data table. So hopefully you've had a chance to review those. I wanted to give just a few notes about those items, and then I'll be here to answer questions you may have about the analysis. Over that 10-year period, there were 586 pedestrian-related crashes. Those 3 items I mentioned: the spatial analysis, the map. A little background on that: the methodology we use, that is a density analysis, so the resulting heat map from that. What we did was calculate the density of crashes, of all of the pedestrian crashes, so all 586 crashes. But then you can see those, the points on the map, those represent the fatal and the disabling injuries. If we tried to map all 586, it just cluttered the map and made it unreadable. But the heat map that results from that is kind of the concentration of all 586 crashes. I think you'll notice on there that the highest density is in the downtown area for overall crashes, but there's a limited number of fatal and disabling injuries in the downtown area. So as you're reviewing that and thinking about the analysis, that's definitely one thing to keep in mind, the conclusion that you can draw from that. So the next table, one more note about that. When we were preparing that density, we looked at not only the total number of crashes, but we also weighted the severity of the injury. So fatal and disabling injuries were weighted a little bit higher. So that is reflected in that map as well. Time of day analysis just gives you a picture of the days of the week and the time of day when those crashes are occurring. And then the data table, the detailed description of each of those crashes. One of the keys with this is really digging in and looking at the incident reports. It's difficult to draw many conclusions just by looking at one of these charts, one of these maps. You really need to look at these crashes as a whole and to determine what the circumstances were, and as a result, what the proposed engineering fixes or the education, the enforcement fixes. We really need to dig in a little bit deeper to determine which corrective actions we need to take. With the data table, there's a field in there that provides a description, and that's from the crash report itself. Try not to draw any conclusions or attribute any blame to parties involved. Really just relaying the information that was in those crash reports. That's really all that I have to share, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about the analysis.
Okay, if you can hang on a minute.
Yes.
Questions from others?
I guess in your explanation of that heat map.
Yes.
It may be a little misleading, but help me understand this because I'm working on a project on the MLK corridor,
Okay.
and I was told that we needed to consider fencing because there are so many pedestrian accidents. However, it's not showing up on this map or along MLK as a major issue. So could you possibly go back and check and let me know whether MLK, not from Winston-Salem State,
Okay.
but from Business 40 to 52, if that's an area for considerable crashes. I do know people break the rules, and they don't follow the rules. They don't cross at the right places.
Sure.
And the other comment was in your data table. I think that's what it showed to me, that I have 20 of those data points where people just didn't cross the street properly. They're out mid-block. It wasn't that we didn't have lights. It's just that they disobeyed. So I guess our strategy might be, how do we educate or get people to comply? But most of those accidents, from what I'm seeing, were their problems, not stuff that we had designed into the land.
Yeah, and I think that gets to the point of the deeper analysis. If we overlaid, for instance, this crash analysis map with a map of where we have pedestrian signalization and crosswalks, that would help us draw more conclusions about what the circumstances were, and the resulting fix that we would pursue. So yeah, to me that would be the next step, is to take that action.
I've got a bunch of questions, but let me recognize other members.
Am I correct in understanding, just recently reports have come out that the national trend for fatalities for pedestrian and bicycle riders is up, the highest it's been in 25 years?
I'm not sure about the time frame, but yes, yeah,
So
crashes are.
It's been decades. That we're seeing a radical increase in the number of fatalities and crashes dealing with individuals. And so what raises the question, one is, looking at the city statistics here, are we seeing trends? And I couldn't really designate that from the data that I was getting. I didn't see any particular trend in all of this. I can't see any geographical other than the downtown area, which remarkably has more crashes, but not as many fatalities, actually.
Low speed.
So
Yeah.
about what you need, and it may be that density question of how many bike riders there are in the whole ambiance of the landscape they're working in is interesting. And I guess what I would hope to see us move toward would be some recommendations for how we actually handle these things. I know there's a lot of things floating out around there. I know in the South Board there's a lot of concerns about, for example, sidewalks. And I'm very cognizant of the need to have alternate pathways for pedestrians to get on. Whether we need to consider widening the sidewalks to allow bike traffic on them as well, or whatever. But there's only so much we can do in striping, and whether that's even effective with brush removal and everything else that's going on, is a problem. So I'm glad. Thank you for bringing that topic up, because I think it's a national problem. And what I'm not clear about is where we can have positive, and how we monitor even this. I think this is something that I would maybe like to see every year, is sort of how many accidents occurred, where they occurred, and recommendations from your department as to mitigation if we're seeing specific areas that we think we could take some immediate action on.
Yeah, to me that is certainly the next step with this, is to determine what corrective actions we can take. And you mentioned the downtown location and the volume of crashes there. The next step also, what we could do, is look at the number of walking trips. So 4th Street downtown, for instance, has 1.4 million walking trips per year. You compare that to some of the areas where we have higher fatality rates for pedestrians, where there's not nearly as much pedestrian activity, but there are more fatalities. The other thing about downtown is that there are lower speeds, so that while there are more crashes, the resulting injuries are not nearly as severe, which highlights the effectiveness of lowering speeds and calming traffic. So those kinds of those are the kinds of recommendations that could come out of this analysis if we just dig a little bit deeper with it and apply some of those other layers.
Well, sorry.
Go ahead.
Some of your deaths are certainly spread way out outside of the urban core.
Yeah.
And that's telling me they're probably in areas that may not even have sidewalks, or may not have hard curb edges, or may be hard for bicycle riders to differentiate where they're on the road and where traffic cars are. And I don't know what we do about those areas, whether there's a widening process that needs to be occurred, whether there's specific corridors. And looking at this, I mean, I think we may want to look at corridors and see if there are areas, not so much of just spread out, shotgun sort of approach, but are the pathways that we're somehow not recognizing this pattern of death, certainly, or maybe even then with crashes. So I think it's a great study, and thank you so much for pulling this up together. Thank you for bringing the topic up. How we pursue on it, I think it's a management tool that we need to now cultivate on. Build on.
Thank you. Yeah, this is good material in terms of collating it in forms that can be reviewed and can offer insights. The heat map versus the location of fatal and disabling accidents, and the fact that there's overlap, but they're not. You've got a bigger spread for the most severe accidents is noteworthy. When you look at the heat, I think it tends to reflect where are people walking. When you look at the severe accidents, it seems to reflect where are they crossing, and where are they walking along higher speed corridors. I think that it would be a useful next step to overlay marked and signalized pedestrian crossings with the crossing related fatalities, and I think it would be useful to correlate the walking in traffic lanes cases with where there's sidewalk. I think we will find a lot of correlation between the former and some with the latter. I know anecdotally some of the fatalities. I mean, I've been tracking these reports as they come out for a decade, and I know the areas well enough for the most part that I know some of the fatalities from people just walking in the traffic lane at night are people who are simply not using the sidewalk that's there. Others are in areas that don't have sidewalks. The crossing fatalities, I think, are less likely to happen in a signalized, pedestrian signalized crossing. That a lot of those that I have seen and said, okay, I know where that is, I know what this is, are happening where there is no designated pedestrian crossing, period. University Parkways, the Silence Creek Parkways, Peters Creek Parkways, and people are crossing where it's most convenient for them because there's no premium to them to go down to an intersection. In fact, it's just as dangerous at the intersection. I would suspect that in our next iteration of review that we'll see patterns that would suggest that we can gain a safety premium from rather modest investments in marked and signalized pedestrian crossings, just at intersections. The sidewalk return, it's valuable, but I don't know if it'll have the quick hit of signalized crossing. Anyway, the time of day table. You've got you've got a spike in the early evening, the 6 to 8 period. And then after dark, I wonder how many of those 6 to 8 happened in the wintertime. It was already dark. Might be useful to go back and see if we can pull that out of the incident data.
Yeah.
There's that spike on Saturday night in the wee hours, and people probably inebriated, at a guess.
I'm going to stay home on Tuesday.
Oh, yeah, I see that.
I'm not,
Between 6 and 8.
I'm not going out on Tuesday.
But, yeah, that's useful. But I'd like to see this come back with the correspondence, because I'm going to be pushing for us to appropriate from capital funding some funding that's earmarked for crossing safety. Also, the kind of thing that we can do without, 2 years of worth of engineering studies. I've talked about other comments. Okay. Yes. Mr. McIntyre.
First, I want to thank Councilmember Bessie for bringing this up. I mean, this is something that we all deal with in our wards too often. And as a 30,000-foot look, I think this is great. The only real through lines I see here is that it's really dangerous to be a pedestrian in Winston-Salem right now. I mean, this level of carnage is pretty dramatic. I mean, I think we've all, I don't think it surprised us, but it's really concerning. The other problem, the problem is that when we go look at these things sort of incident by incident, there's so many of them are site specific. You don't have the width of the road, the amount of cars traveling, the average speed, whether or not you have right of way to take into account. I mean, so the solutions are hard to do one size fits all. And we've done walking, pedestrian audits in areas and come up with some good ideas that are doable with just paint. Because I think we've all also been through that frustration of doing neighborhood meetings and not being able to get 70% buy-in on a traffic calming solution when something just really needs to be done. So this is great. I think what we're trying to do is reverse decades of traffic engineering that emphasized efficiency of throughput on cars versus the health and safety of pedestrians. And that we're going back and reversing an awful lot of investment that's in the ground and concrete, and it's expensive to go back and change it. But I think the numbers here and the totals show us pretty clearly that we got to do it. Thank you.
And I think one other thing that may have been too obvious to mention but ought to be is that the fatalities, I think, are occurring where people are walking who have to walk.
Yep.
So there is a very clear economic factor.
Very definitely.
And we need to keep that in mind in deciding what our priority spots are. We can't just put equipment and sidewalk concrete in areas that we have the public actively calling for it because they're the neighborhood activists. They're the folks who get out and walk for their health and who know about the issues, and they know how to complain to their elected representatives. We need to get those crossings marked and signalized out where people are walking because that is their primary means of transportation. I'm sorry, Ms. Sylvia.
Got one question. I happen to have been fortunate enough to live in California where the pedestrians have the right of way, and no matter where you step in the street, the cars have to stop. But I wonder, I'm real curious whether that really is working and has stopped some of the pedestrian deaths, fatalities, or injuries. And I wondered if there's an easy way to just see if there's any data that says where the pedestrians truly have the right of way, that they see less fatalities and less
Sure. Yeah, I understand. So legally, that is the case here as well. If you step into the street in a crosswalk, driver must yield to you. The difference is in different regions that the culture is different, and in certain regions, drivers certainly abide by that law. In other regions, they don't. And that's where, we've talked about some engineering fixes with sidewalks and pedestrian signals and crosswalks, but the other components, the education, the enforcement components, are important to help change that culture. And the item last night that we considered, the Watch For Me campaign, would be an important part of changing that enforcement and education component.
I never have lived here where I felt that pedestrian had the right of way.
Yeah.
That's not our culture. But I know in California it is their culture, and you will get ticketed if you don't yield. So, but if you could just find out whatever you can find
Sure.
out between something as drastic as really the pedestrian truly has the right of way versus what we have here.
Where they have the cultural right of way, I think will make a difference. Where they have the legal right of way, I think you're right. It's if you're crossing at mid-block, if the driver sees you, they're obligated to stop if necessary.
Full
and
stop.
Let you pass. I mean, it's not open season out there under the law anywhere. But whether they're going to be watching for you is the key. Mr. McIntosh.
Since this is going to reach some portion of the general populace, I want to go back to something that you said on our last pedestrian audit, is that as a pedestrian, you should look to see if you make eye contact with the car. Don't assume that they're going to stop, but make sure they see you. Make eye contact. To me, that's just incredibly important, whether you're in another car or on foot or whatever. I mean, I think that's a real good, easy educational point to give to people to save lives. Thanks for that.
From a long-time running standpoint, my philosophy always was that if they didn't see me, that was just as well, because if they did see me, the assumption had to be that they were trying to get me.
Yep.
But I want us to be safer in fact. So thank you. Now, we did have Mr. Summers. You had also signed up to talk about pedestrian safety. Did you have any other comments?
Yeah, I'm going to yield it for no, I'm good.
Okay.
No, I mean, my comments earlier were just the more people we have using the streets, the better.
Okay. Dr. O'Gara, would you like a couple of minutes to talk about pedestrian
Well,
safety?
I just said we did the pedestrian audit with...
Would you like to come up to the mic where everybody in TV land can hear you?
It's not humorous, but it is. We did the pedestrian audit with Mr. McIntosh and Robert Clark, and Mr. McIntosh. It was a humorous scene. We got into his ward, and he tried to cross Robin Hood Road, and Peace Haven was almost struck, and it was just a scene with Miss McCullough almost yelling at him, "No, no!" And it was at the intersection. And the intersection is, and they cross mid-block, because my son, I tell him, you have to go up the intersection. He says, "No way, Dad. I get to work by crossing mid-block because the intersection is treacherous." And so it was a crazy scene. And then we got to Bobo's and sat down, and Robert Clark made a comment that at first blush sounded outrageous, but in retrospect was right on the mark. He said, this area should just be pedestrian-free. We should ban pedestrians because it is so dangerous. And again, it's about our young adults. How can we tell the young adults throughout our community that in order to get your first job, you need to go into debt to buy a car? And I work with Pam Peoples-Joyner with the police department. I've been over to Ladera Crest, and we're trying to do positive things in the community around sports and getting these young people out at night. And they're just like my sons and daughters, and these young people can't get out. They can't do after-school activities. They can't because mom's at home working, and she doesn't have time to drive them everywhere. So we have it's the number one public relations societal issue I see that is right in front of us, but we're so used to it that we just don't pay attention to. We don't realize that the people on the sides of the roads are our brothers and sisters. You know, we wouldn't have the story of the Good Samaritan in modern day society because we wouldn't have seen the person on the side of the road. We wouldn't stop. It's a huge public problem, and I treat these people every day, and the injuries are awful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Merritt. And there are places where you have signs that say no pedestrians, like on narrow bridges that are heavily traveled.
Yeah.
And people walk on them anyway because it's the
Anyway.
only way they have to get to the other side. So we've got to recognize that there are people who are walking in part because that's the only way they have to get to work. And they have to get to work where their job is, not where the sidewalks are nice and convenient.
Mr. Hodge, I think we have to calm the traffic. That is the number one issue, just putting in a crosswalk is we have to calm the traffic.
Okay. Other points or questions this evening from council members? All right. Thank you to the staff who collected and prepared this data. I'm not sure whether we want to bring this back in March or April. What? We have a request for April. Okay. But I'm going to be using what I've got in the meantime. Yes.
Yeah, I anticipate sort of an annual update. I'm not sure what happens in April, but I would like to then, I think very quickly we're going to see electric scooters in this mix. And I think the program that's being designed will allow us to gather in that data. And I think that should be added to our statistical base for bicycles and pedestrians.
Yeah. And now, this does not include bicycles as well. So that would be a different map and a legitimate one to pursue.
I think anything.
And what we're coming back in April is an overlay of where crossings are safe and available and where sidewalks are available, so we can test my theory
I see.
that if we improve the signalized crossings, that will address a lot of those pedestrian struck mid-block, pedestrian struck at an unsignalized intersection. Not all of them, but it's a lot more practical to get started on improving the crossing safety than it is on retrofitting the entire length of every street and road in the city. Okay, anything else, as they say, for the good of the order this evening? Nope. All right, thank you all for helping with this, and we'll come back to it. Thank you. We're adjourned.